Hey everyone, welcome to my channel where today I'll be showing you how I made this super modern TV display unit. Let's get to it. For this entire project, I'll be using only one sheet of 18mm birch plywood. To start things off, I split the sheet into two halves and began ripping the first board down into the parts that would make up the box to house the TV. The second board will be broken down to create the leg structure that this box will sit on. After cutting everything out, I moved over to the miter saw to trim the ends of the panels for the box with a 45-degree cut. This was to hide the plywood edges and to give it a nice clean look and finish. With the ends of the panels cut, I used a tabletop router to make a 9mm rebate along the back edges of each panel as a way of joining all the side panels of the box to the back. I then turned my attention to adding a 9mm rebate to the back panel. This was a fairly straightforward process of creating a matching cut to the ones that I had just done on the side panels, and because I had never used a handheld router before, I chose to make this cut in multiple passes and creep up to the final depth. Now that all the pieces for the box were cut and good to go, I grabbed my ratchet straps and Gorilla wood glue and began assembling the box. For any of those wondering, the dimensions of the box are 1070mm wide, 670mm high, and 115mm deep. The height and width are based on the dimensions of my 42-inch Sony TV with a 40mm gap surrounding it, plus the 18mm plywood box, and the depth takes into account the back panel, plus the TV mount and the thickness of the TV. Once the glue had dried, I began applying an iron-on birch veneer edge banding to cover up the visible end grain on the front faces of the plywood. The edge banding that I used for this project is 40mm wide, so once applied I used a chisel to carefully remove the excess. The reason for choosing 40mm edge banding and not a thinner one is because I'll be using the same reel when building the legs, and they measure 36mm wide, and it saved on buying two different reels. It's a really easy product to use, and it helps to create a premium finish to your work once cleaned up. Speaking of legs, here they are. To make the legs and the underframe, I decided to double down on the plywood for each component. This meant cutting out 8 legs, 4 side struts, 4 cross beams and 4 top struts. There were two deciding factors for doing this. The first being, I didn't feel that 18mm would be thick enough to make a sturdy frame. And secondly, the reason for me using only one sheet of plywood for the entire project was so that anyone watching this that wants to make their own version, all they need to do is go down to their local DIY store and pick up one sheet of material. So that left me with the only option to double up. Whilst this footage of me cutting out the tenons for the legs plays out, I wanted to give you a bit of a backstory to how I came about with this idea. For a while I had been looking at replacing my old TV unit, and I couldn't help but think about how far TVs have advanced over the years, but our approach to displaying them in our homes hasn't kept up. For the most part, TVs are either fixed to the wall or placed on top of a cabinet. And a cabinet made sense when you had lots of accessories for your TV like a Sky box or a DVD player, or if you're my age, a VHS player. But nowadays everything is built into an app, so these cabinets have become a magnet for clutter. I also found most cabinets quite dull, and I wanted something a little more fun, something with a bit more character. So I came up with this. The main focus was to make the TV and the stand feel like one entity rather than a TV plonked on a cabinet, and to be visually clear of clutter, hence why there is no storage underneath. I will be adding a shelf to the back so that games consoles and cable management boxes can be stored out of the way but still easily accessed when needed. With the tenons cut, it was time to tackle the mortises. Here I am marking out where the mortises will go on the legs. This nifty machine here is a mortiser. It's basically the offspring of a pillar drill and a chisel, and it makes light work of mortises. The external part gives you crisp corners, and a drill bit inside bores out the wood. Top stuff. Here I'm marking out the first of many holes that will be going into the top struts. These tiny parts play quite an important role within the leg structure. The first set of holes that I'm drilling are for the 45mm M6 bolts that will connect the leg structure to the underneath of the TV. Next was to drill two 8mm holes either end of the top strut. This is for the dowels that will be used to connect the legs to the top strut. I then followed this up by marking up the matching holes on the legs and then drilled those out. Now that all the necessary holes are drilled, I sanded down each component before gluing it all together. I started at 100 grit and worked my way up to 120. Once the legs are glued together, I'll give it a final pass of 180 grit. When it came to gluing the leg frames together, I discovered that my mortise and tenon joints were a tad on the loose side, which I wasn't too surprised by given these were my first attempt at them, so my solution was simple: lots and lots of wood glue. With the joints thoroughly drowned in glue, I used my ratchet straps to pull everything together. I cannot tell you enough how useful these are, and if you don't have any, I recommend that you do. They are super helpful at clamping unusual shaped pieces together. I also placed a spacer bar at the top of the legs to make sure that the TV box would still fit into place, and then repeated this process for the other set of legs. With the glue dry, I removed the straps and was pleased to see that both sets of legs were the same. Given that the joints were a little loose, I was expecting them to be slightly misaligned, but that wasn't the case. I then went ahead and used wood filler to fill in any gaps I could find. I found a few. Once the filler had dried, I did a final pass of sanding, finishing on 180 grit. And where the sander couldn't reach, I went back and I sanded it by hand, paying particular attention to soften the edges ever so slightly. The next thing to do for the legs was trim their bases so that they would sit flat on the floor. Once trimmed, I gave them a quick pass over on the belt sander, and to finish them off, I'll apply sticky felt pads so that they don't scratch the floor. The next step was to drill two 7mm holes in the side of the leg frames. These two holes will connect the cross beams that run underneath the TV box and between the legs, and I countersunk all of the holes because I will be using M6 bolts to connect this all together, and I want the heads to sit flush with the frame. I then proceeded to drill and countersink 3 holes at even intervals along the cross beam that the TV box will sit on. This is so that I can secure the box to the cross beam using, you've guessed it, more M6 bolts. The final step for the cross beams was to drill a hole at each end using a 9mm drill bit. This was so that I could place a threaded insert into each beam for the bolts to go into. With the leg structure assembled, I placed it on the TV box as centrally as possible and then used a drill bit to mark where each threaded insert needed to go. I then used the tried and tested, put a bit of tape on your drill bit to mark your depth technique to prevent me from drilling all the way through the plywood, and followed this up with a countersink so that the threaded inserts were flush with the wood. The next thing to do was sand the TV box. Now retrospectively, I feel that I should have done this before gluing it together because getting into those corners was certainly a challenge, but hindsight is a wonderful thing. To protect the legs, I chose to paint them in a satin finish black. I opted for this finish because I thought it was a nice contrast against the birch ply, and I also felt that leaving them au naturel would be too much wood grain on show. For the TV box, I went for 2 coats of Osmo Poly-X oil in a satin finish. It's super easy to work with. You simply apply a generous first coat, wipe off the excess and let it dry. Once it's dried, you give it a light high grit sanding and then apply another coat. Job done. With all the finishes applied, all that was left to do was assemble this thing. And whilst you watch me do that, I just wanted to take this opportunity to say that I hope you're enjoying this video, and if you are, then a subs to the channel would be great, and if you're feeling really generous, you could even like the video. The shelf that I'm about to stick on the back of the box is cut from the same sheet of plywood that was used for this project, and it measures 800mm by 165mm, and the brackets I found on Amazon. I should also point out that the total depth of this unit from back to front is less than 470mm, which is similar to a standard TV cabinet, and the hole for the cables to go through is 30mm in diameter.
Okay, so there's a little bit of a confession here. I haven't shown any footage of me drilling this in because, in all honesty, I was winging it. I knew it had to be in the middle somewhere-ish, but because the VESA mounts on your TV, they can differ model to model. I just didn't know where it was, so there's a lot of holes around here from where I learnt where the middle was. So if you are going to make this, just be wary of that when you put your bracket in, okay?
All that's left to do now is hook the TV into the bracket, plug the cables in, and we are done. I tried a lot of new things out with this project, and I'm really glad that I did, because I couldn't be happier with how it came out. I love the clean, minimalistic lines of the design, and by having the gap around the TV, it makes it feel like it's floating inside the box, which I think is really neat. I'm also really pleased that I challenged myself by making the legs using the mortise and tenon method, as I haven't really used that technique before, and I think it came out pretty good. And having the shelf at the back to hide unnecessary clutter really helps make the design look clean and modern. That's it for this episode. Again, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already to stay up to date, and I'll see you next time.